Good morning again, everyone. I hope you're well caffeinated. Can I request you to move up front? This session is about climate finance, and for those of us who want finance to continue our work, we would encourage you to move up front, please. This is also going to be an interactive session. And before I start calling names of all of the colleagues who I know in the room, can I invite you to move up front, please, on the tables towards the front? Colleagues who have just come into the room, please move up front. Take a seat up front. This is going to be an interactive session, and it would be great to have us all sitting closer to each other. All right, great. Thank you to those of you who are walking ahead here. My name is Manisha Gulati. I'm a research associate with ODI, and I have been part of the SPARC program for the last 4 years. Now, for those of you who are looking at the title and wondering how climate finance fits with the theme of this dialogue, what are the links with pastoralists? What are the links with drylands? Let me tell you that SPARC is not just a research program. It has a very strong and a solid technical assistance component. And one of these components is building resilience and adaptation to climate shocks in fragile and conflict-affected settings. Now, as part of this component, we've done extensive work on mobilization of climate finance in fragile and conflict-affected settings. In fact, we've done research and advisory work in more than 10 countries. I'll give you examples: Somalia, Eritrea, South Sudan, Niger, Chad, wider IGAD region. And to tell us about what SPARC has learned in the last 6 years, as part of this work, we've put together a distinguished set of experts who have been our researchers, our partners, our collaborators, and advisors on the program. Can I request all of the speakers, the experts, to please stand up so that everyone in the room knows who you are? UA, Dr. Abdullahi Khalif, Emmanuel, Guyo, Mutoni, Nasra, thank you, and Isaiah. Thank you very much. So you know who our speakers are. But before I ask each of them to tell us about what they have learned from the work that SPARC has done, we're going to take a step back. I would like you to know, why did SPARC do this work in the first place? What prompted us to say climate finance is important to build resilience in fragile and conflict-affected settings? And to do that, I am going to call my colleague Yue Kao. Yue, please. Yue is a research associate at ODI Global and is going to be telling us why we started this work.
Thank you, Manisha. Good morning again, everyone. I hope that you are all feeling energized after the coffee break. And for those that are entering now in the room, I would like to invite you to please come a little bit forward, because we would like this to be an interactive session. My name is Yue Kao. I am a research associate at ODI Global, where I work on climate adaptation and financing of resilience. And as Manisha was saying, today my job is to tell you a little bit of a story of why we came to work on this issue of climate financing in countries that are affected by conflict and fragility, just as a way to frame the panel discussions that we're going to have following. And as you've heard throughout yesterday, SPARC is a program that supports pastoralists in context of recurrent and protracted crises. And you've also heard that the pastoralists and pastoralist communities are some of the most vulnerable communities to the impacts of climate change. But we've also heard that they're also doing things and showing remarkable resilience at the same time. And I'm trained as an economist, so that's how my brain works. And when I looked at this issue, what I was interested in were the economic aspects of this. And more specifically, I was interested in how financial resources are supporting pastoralists and pastoral communities in adapting to climate change and in building resilience. Just a sec. I just realized that we didn't have the other presentation, PowerPoint. Okay. Yeah. All right. So as I was saying, what we did then, what we embarked in this really exploratory piece of research, where we had a key question in our mind, which was how is climate finance supporting countries in the Sahel and the Horn of Africa in addressing climate change? And we focused across the region because that's where SPARC works. It works across 18 countries in this region. But we also did 3 extended country case studies in Mali, Somalia, and Sudan, exploring this question. And throughout the research, the various challenges and unaddressed problems that we uncovered, we came to call them all together the conflict blind spot in climate finance. And you'll understand in a moment why we decided to frame it in this way. So what did we find? What were the main learnings? We had 3 of them. The first key finding is that climate finance is neglecting countries that are affected by conflict and fragility. It is not targeting them, it is not getting there. So this graph shows the per capita climate finance of LDC countries, the least developed countries, against their level of vulnerability. So you have on the horizontal axis, the vulnerability, climate vulnerability as measured by the NDK index. So going to the right, it becomes less vulnerable. Going to the left, it becomes more vulnerable. On the vertical axis, you have the per capita climate finance on a cumulative terms between 2012 and 2022. And please note that there is a logarithmic scale, which means that small change is a big change in money. You also have groups of countries color-coded differently. As I said, all the countries on this graph, they are least developed countries. The ones in red, there are also those that are fragile or affected by conflict according to the World Bank classification. They have a list for this. The greens are just the least developed countries, and the blue ones are the fragile and conflict-affected states, small island developing states. And you can see clearly the trend there, right? So the countries that are getting more money are the ones that are least vulnerable or less vulnerable. So that tells you that there is a problem in the international system, because all the international agreements that we have, starting from the climate accords, so the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, but also the Sustainable Development Goals, and so on, they all commit us to support countries that are more vulnerable. But this is not currently happening, or at least the trend is not happening. The second key finding, similar in a way, is that climate finance within countries at the national and subnational level is missing those most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And that's because oftentimes they live in hotspots of conflict and violence. So they are missing those locations, those places and communities and people, and therefore they're missing opportunities to build resilience. This is just an example from Mali that emerged from our research. This first map shows you the climate vulnerability at the subnational level within the country. The red colors means that those are the areas that are more vulnerable. The blue ones are those that are comparatively less vulnerable. So you can see the difference between the northeast and the southwest of the country. But if we overlay that with where the projects, climate adaptation projects, are actually going, we can see that it's in a way the inverse. So the projects are concentrating in the southwest. So those are the ones that have like darker blue colors. Whereas in the northeast, where there is the climate vulnerability is higher, it is not going there. And I also want you to pay some attention to the white dot around the capital city of Bamako, which means there are fewer projects there. And this can be explained in big part to what I said before, that even at the subnational level within countries, climate finance is not targeting places that are affected by conflict or high levels of fragility. And this last map shows you exactly that. It's a compilation of reported violent events from the ARCLET data set between 2018 and 2020-21. And you can see where they cluster, right? Around Bamako, capital district, and towards the east and northeast of the country, where fewer projects went there. Now, these findings or this sort of claim they are making was not just based on the data, because data can be deceiving. We also did a lot of stakeholder consultations that validated qualitatively these findings, and they were saying, yes, this is also what we are observing. And the last finding, key finding, is that the climate finance architecture at low levels is not designed for fragile and conflict-affected settings. This is happening at the international level, and that's because the particular challenges that these countries, institutions, and communities face in accessing these international sources of finance, they are not well represented or recognized in international climate treaties, such as the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. A big reason is because of when these treaties were created, the understanding at the time of these issues, and also the negotiated outcomes. But this is important because international treaties set the mandates for a lot of international and multilateral organizations in how they can support states, institutions, and communities, which means that without that mandate, it is much harder for them to support these countries or this context in a more tailored way that is more fit for context. At the national and local level, what we observed is that national institutions and communities, they're facing a lot of challenges, a lot of barriers in accessing these funding mechanisms. And that's because these funding mechanisms were developed for stabler context. And so oftentimes, very often, they're considered to be too complex, too onerous for the current capacity of these countries. And I just give you some examples. There's much more richness in all the research that we've done, starting from that initial report. But one example could be that these countries, they need to demonstrate strong public financial management systems while they're still under development. They also require climate data for a long period of time for project proposals and funding requirements, but oftentimes conflict may have destroyed meteorological stations and data centers. So this data is often lacking. But there are problems of access to locations to collect basic socioeconomic data to be able to implement projects, programs, but also to monitor progress and so on. At the organizational level, at the time when we did the research, what we noticed was that many funders, bilaterals and multilaterals, but also implementing organizations, they lack dedicated strategies to work in a fit for context manner on climate resilience in fragile and conflict-affected settings. And what is a dedicated strategy? In simple terms, it is just a commitment to solve a problem in a different way, oftentimes because what has been done so far hasn't worked. And we know that without these dedicated strategies of such commitment, it is harder to corral an entire organization, institution behind such objective. We also observed that internally in organizations, the processes, rules and requirements and culture oftentimes prevented people in engaging more deeply and deciding to work on this context because they were perceived to be risky and also risky for individual careers. So the problem was that the incentives and the vision didn't support working in this kind of context. So in summary, the whole climate finance architecture was, and to a great extent, I think, is still very risk averse. It perceives very high costs associated with investing and working in this context. But this approach ignores the fact that at the same time, if you're not doing that, you're ignoring the ever-growing costs of inaction. And so I just want to conclude by saying that over the past 5 years, ODI through SPARC has worked to improve, influence, and change the system at all the levels that I mentioned. And today you'll be hearing from a fantastic panel of speakers with whom we've worked with to learn from this experience. Thank you.
Thank you. While we get the list of speakers back up again, so you remember who our experts are in the room today, I want to add a statistic to what UA has just told us. In 2021, 12 of the 15 most climate vulnerable countries had a bill for emergency humanitarian assistance. The costs of being reactive were increasingly overwhelming, and they continue to be. But that is the context in 2021 when SPARC started this work on climate finance. And to tell you a bit more about this context, build on this context to understand why this work has been so important, we invite Nasra. Nasra, we've been increasingly seeing that the intersection of climate shocks and conflict is leaving people more and more vulnerable to climate shocks and is making them less able to cope and adapt to climate change. Tell us from your work what you're seeing on the ground and what is the role that finance plays building climate resilience in these settings.
Hi, sorry. My expertise in technology is very limited. I didn't know it was up. I'm Nasra Hussein. I work with Grant Solutions. We work across the world to understand community and collect their views on their key priorities, needs, their standing on the perspective of the aid delivered to them, and also the change they want to see in how these aid can be prioritized and also delivered. We are currently working in Somalia. We collected views to close to 7,000 individuals to understand on the above issues I mentioned. We collected data from marginalized groups and the community groups that we don't even hear about, that youth, in aim to support aid to be delivered efficiently and sustainable. In every context we work across the world, we see communities complaining climate change as an addition to the already existing challenges they are facing on the ground, even in the most acute crisis. A community member noted he and his family were from one of the river and nature villages. Now they are in the IDPs in Mogadishu, the capital city of Somalia. He said they have livestock and pastoralism, but now with the rains are becoming unpredictable, shorter, and the long dry seasons are getting longer, he doesn't know how him and the members like him in the IDP could see a viable future where they practice farming and also livestock rearing. We also hear quite clearly from the communities that they are tired and feel trapped in short-term life cycles of humanitarian aid. They say we want to see a life where we can live on our own terms and we can have future aspirations. We had a community member in Goldoro IDP say, where these aids are, I feel like we are spoon fed. But the next time it comes, we don't have anything to cope with. So the cycle continues. Again, besides that, the sweeping humanitarian fund, the major element in the room, the funding humanitarian fund means we have less resources for the coming year than ever we had before. And in response to that, humanitarian actors are prioritizing on emergency life-saving, leaving a space behind for the factors that drove those issues before. In order to prevent those crises, the things we can do include adaptation of livelihoods, climate infrastructure. If we don't do that and climate finance actors don't step up, we are risking communities small and limited headwinds to go back to the cycle. As the young man in the IDP, in Mogadishu IDP said, without foundation to stand on, recovery is impossible. So climate finance is needed more than ever before. Thank you.
Can you use data from Somalia to tell us about what the need is? Because Somalia was the first country where SPARC started work in 2022. It was where we first undertook research and advisory work to support the government, donors, and international actors alike to help unpack climate finance and the barriers for Somalia to accessing climate finance. But I'm not going to tell you about that. To do that, I'm going to invite Abdullahi Khalif. When we started work in 2022, the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change had just been formed. And as we sit for this discussion right now, Somalia has accessed the Green Climate Fund, $100 million. Somalia is getting 2 national institutions accredited to the Green Climate Fund and has set up a national climate finance facility. What have we learned in this journey?
Thank you, Manisha. Thank you, Favourite. I like this kind of setting. First of all, when the moderator, I mean the panel discussions are not sitting there, but they are here. And I tell you the reason why we have chosen this. Many of us sometimes are busy for our phones and computers. So I think what we need is your interaction as you're needing our interaction. And I think it's a bit healthy to leave your phones and computers for a minute, not only for participation, but also for health-wise. Thank you. For the question, I still remember about, I was by that time, NDC partnership was asking me and negotiating to be recruited as the NDC country facilitator. And I remember I was reached by my very good colleague here, friend, Maurizio and Manisha, and asked me, we wanted to do this study, so what do you think? And I said, this is very, very important because we've been reviewing the country's NDC by that time. And I said, the current NDC of Somalia is unimplementable and uninvestable because it was based in number one, an assumption that has been built in which went into that document. And it was asking 55 billion US dollars for 10 years, which is not realistic. So I said to them, number one, when we look up, there's a lot of information here. One, Somalia is one of the most affected countries when it comes into climate. I am heading Marine Early Warning Systems, FuseNet, for 6 years as a country director, and I witnessed the 2011 famine for Somalia, which I was among the people who declared. So I knew how much that climate shocks affected Somalia. Two, we did FAO together with me, FuseNet, FSNAU, we did a study from 1960 to 2040, 100 years, how the climate shocks affected Somalia. And we saw how the progressive of the drought and famine exponentially increasing in Somalia. Then we said, yes, this kind of study, and I remember discussing like we have to focus, one, climate finance, two, loss and damage of those studies. So what those studies have been several layers of benefits in Somalia. Manisha just mentioned a few. But when we decided to review the NDC, we said, okay, what is the climate finance level of Somalia? And I think in that study, we found the 320 million for the year of 2019-2020 over the last 10 years. And then we said like 320 million, yes, but what has it been financed again? And it was saying, like, when we dissected into that financing, we found 70%, it was from others, not adaptation, not mitigation. So others, how can you define? Capacity building, I mean, the institutional arrangement, what is it? 60% of that money went into other one, rather than adaptation funding and the mitigation funding and the loss and damage. So in that case, we said, okay, Now we have this. But let's do, since we are reviewing the NDC, and we wanted to come up the NDC 3.0, which is mandatory to Paris Agreement to all countries to cover the NDCs in 2025, we must do this stock take. So we did this stock take. And that stock take study was based on, okay, this is the climate finance, this is the loss of damage, nothing. Then we went into the ground again as a basis of this study. And then we said, okay, what are the priorities of this? So we came up, adaptation priorities, loss and damage priorities, I mean the climate finance priorities. And we, as we review the NDC COP28 came in, and I remember us going to Dubai and talking and sitting and launching the review process where the president of Somalia, His Excellency Dr. Asisha, launched together with many other dignitaries. I still remember the Minister of Development for UK and the Secretary General, all those guys. And I remember head of GCF, Stuvalda, saying Somalia now has a plan. So you see, and that is how the 100 million that Manisha has just mentioned came in. And it was that collective effort. And as a researcher, as a lecturer, who believes what research can do, that's exactly what it is. Now, having said that, that is just one part of the outcome of these steps. Then we moved forward. I'm sorry, I'm taking more time, I guess. We moved them forward and we said, okay, this is now the NDC 3.0 for Somalia is ready. And it became, despite being most fragile and conflict-affected country, the first African country which submitted to NDC 3.0 to UNFCCC. Kenya was the first country. Thank you. Kenya was the first country, but I remember Kenya submitted NDC 2.0. But Somalia submitted NDC 3.0. So, and it is a well-informed document that is based on the outcome of many researches, including this. So what has been done? NDC is in place. I mean, the NAP is placed. It has been released just the last week. National Transformation Plan. And if you look at all those documents, climate finance is a big thing. And the formation of the climate finance unit and at the beginning office of the president, but now moved in the right direction to the Ministry of Finance. But now again, we said, how can we harmonize with all these initiatives that we have? And then, for example, NDC partnership made focal points for the country, which is now the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change and the Ministry of Finance. So in a nutshell, if I say I will continue on the outcomes of such studies, I may not stop and I may go back to my lecturing practice, which I don't want. So Manisha, allow me to stop there, but it is really, really beneficial.
Thank you. More time than we had requested you. But I hope, colleagues, you hear what he's spoken about, and that is the kind of support that SPARC has provided in all of the countries, in most of the countries, where it has done this research work on climate finance. Continuing on the discussions that we're having on Somalia, Isaiah, your work has helped us iteratively learn about building resilience to climate shocks, working with communities. Tell us a bit about what you are learning and whether climate finance is actually helping build resilience on the ground and is giving us those long-term resilience gains that we need to get in the context that we spoke.
Thanks, Manisha. So hello, everybody. My name is Isaiah Seifert. I work for the BRICS Consortium. BRICS standing for Building Resilient Communities in Somalia. and it being a family, shall I say, of 5 international NGOs and then 10 local civil society organizations that join us as well. As Manisha mentioned, we are implementing partnership with growing experience of trying to apply climate adaptive solutions in the context of Somalia. But maybe I can start by answering one of our last questions, which is, has climate finance helped us to do that? My answer is no, because we haven't received any climate finance in this journey, right? And it raises the question for me, and I'm talking formal capital C, capital F climate finance, right? The GCFs, the adaptation funds, all of those pieces of finance that we talk about from a development perspective. We've received $0, 0 Somali shillings, 0 any currency. But why are we anyways able to do climate adaptation and have a learning and growing experience? It's because we said we should not wait. And we've been responsive to the needs and desires and priorities of the communities with whom we've had a long-term partnership. And so through BRICS's traditional, it's very traditional community development planning, participatory approaches in communities, asking what are your needs, what are your priorities, what are your aspirations? And when we decided to move beyond seeing a school as a school or a job as a job, and there being underlying aspirations there that related to trying to regulate their relationship with natural resources, we took that as permission to go into all of our conversations with our existing funders. Our existing funders who consider themselves as wearing the humanitarian cap, for example, and saying, if you want to address these needs as communities see them, we're going to start doing climate action now. We're not going to wait for development funding. We're not going to wait for stability. We're going to continue maintaining our long-term relationship with communities and using that as the entry point in a fragile context for climate adaptation. So it's through that process of advocacy and a refusal to wait for formal financing to come later that I think we've started to build the case. And what are we doing now? We're creating supply of adaptive interventions, right? We're proving examples of what can be done in this fragile context without waiting for a stability or a development benchmark. And then we're also increasing the demand, right? So one of the very traditional climate adaptation measures in the context of rangelands, I think folks are largely familiar with half moons and rangeland restoration through half moons. So just by bringing that into Somalia, piloting that, we're early stages, maybe 8 months into a process with something like that. But our staff came to me and they said, did you know that the Puntland Parliament posted our photos in their parliamentary session of half moons capturing water? Did you know that that photo is now displayed in the Ministry of Environment's office in Puntland at the entrance anytime somebody comes in? So what does that do? That creates obviously demand, that provides supply, and it's from there we're proving that we didn't wait to meet all the criteria of the GCF in order to finance this. We didn't wait to make sure we could document exact compliance to every World Bank ESS standard, right? We took control of the flexible finance we had access to prove the case. So I think more than anything, that's my contribution here. I will echo anything any speaker has to say about global climate finance needing to come sooner, be more effective, and work better in fragile contexts. But we cannot and should not wait for that to happen, because we'll be waiting a long time. So start working now with what resources are available, realizing it is highly cost effective, especially when you're working closely with communities. We're talking largely labor contributions to a lot of the community-led adaptation that we're talking about under our programming. So I'm just going to stop there, but really challenge all of us to think about it in that way. Mafalda will come eventually with her dollars, but what are we doing now with what we have?
Thank you, Scott. The capital F of climate finance not being accessible. That is a story we can take from Somalia to the wider IGAD region. We've seen from SPARC's work in South Sudan, for example, how the rising costs of humanitarian needs due to climate shocks is overwhelming us. These climate shocks continue to get more frequent and more intense. Guyo, we've had this discussion several times, but you also mentioned it We have seen examples of climate financing models and approaches, but these are not working. They're not working for anyone in the region. Can I invite you here to tell us what the challenges are, what we are seeing in the wider IGAD region on these challenges?
Thank you very much. My name is William Robert. I work with IGAD Center for Pastoral Areas and Livestock Development as the head of the dryland and pastoralism. Yeah, I think the question is very big. It's a question that takes many directions. But I think just to start, for those who are new to climate financing, it's a global mechanism that is globally designed, globally executed. And this problem with that, I think it's the conceptual problem, the climate financing. I want to separate the response to two parts. The first part is that the global financing is based on some commitment, and the commitments are not so much need-based. So that's where everything. So the needs are far ahead of the commitment. For some of us who are there, the commitment was made in 2019, $100 billion. But then when you look at some of the studies, they can't meet it. The countries that need climate financing is at $1.3 trillion by 2035. So which means we are behind in the commitment. But then the bigger part of the problem is not just the commitment. Very hard. At least I've looked for all the studies to look at how this fund flow. What is the accounting system within that global mechanism? Trackers between commitment, legal measure to commit, only to get the commitment. All these things are the bigger picture of the climate financing architecture that's very problematic. I used to work with IUCN, the program, and IUCN, with a long struggle, became chief of rehabilitation. And there's big politics around chief of rehabilitation and all these things. The big picture is it takes 2 to 3 years from the project conception to delivery. Within the pipelines, it's a very long process. And that process, the climate change emergency cannot wait for that. I think the colleague quite clearly said that. So what do you have as you wait? When you come from the city, when you have a pregnant camel, you still need one to milk. Where does the milk come from as you wait for the pregnancy? So the second part, the bigger part, is within the region, we have multiple layers of issues that really stops the climate financing model to work. The global system and the local realities very different. The local realities has multiple layers of issues. The first issue is the technical capacity to respond to these opportunities in the climate financing. Climate financing requires very high level quality pipeline because you commit to a local sector, and each sector has its own efficiency, multiplicities of people and interest. So the pipeline from the region is a big problem because we don't have capacity to develop very different kind of project or backup project, so to speak. The second, I think, is the data question. The entire climate financing is based on some enormous data. And when you don't have good data, it's very hard for you to downscale to specific countries and markets. If you don't have specific context, then you fail in the bankable code. These things are all linked, in my experience. So the entire defense process of showing how bankable it is looking for data in countries which are already struggling with their own population data. Their own, how many people are vulnerable, how many livestock is lost. I work with ILRI, and we keep on saying, we say we have lost 9.3 million livestock in the region. That nobody knows where the data comes from. That number is reused and then it's institutionalized. So we're still questioning, is it the loss or is it the perceived loss? How did you get the number? So coming from that level, to a level that you now have to argument your case and show the compatibility of the project is a big issue. The third, from where I sit, is climate change is what we call problem without passport. It crosses all the frontiers of the right. What it means is that you need to have joint planning and coordination to face these common realities that bind countries. But then every country is struggling at its own having global regional commitment to push an agenda of managing drought well within our risk thinking. We still have a lot of problem in terms of getting consensus of how do we position drought as a big issue, how do we make our commitment to responding to drought emergency as our long-term commitment. So we're not getting to that level. And finally, I think the listing, the potential finance listing, if you look at, unfortunately, we are all plugged with global public financing, and I think private sector financing is coming out very clearly in few countries. But then, what kind of private sector position we have in the region to bridge the gap between the international funding mechanism to the realities that we have? So all these multiple issues, I think, for me, is what presents very difficult situation. And I sometimes ask my friend or tell my colleagues, I don't consider climate financing as one of my go-to funding, because it takes very long. It comes, it's very uncertain. You don't know the split between accrediting agencies. Sometimes you present 2 or 3 proposals on dryland, and then 4 aspects of it. It's quite interesting. When you look at the GF list and the TCF project that are funded. So, and I think in the dryland, there's few typical dryland project that is funded. I think it's not more than 10 years. I used to go to first TCF funding, 20 towards every cloud emergency. I was part of the team that is proposal. But we got about 3 years of extract, almost not like attending the defense or PhD proposal. So it takes very, very long time. So that's the entire arrangement and how all the discipline makes finance flow difficult and actually makes us not to get the money in time when we need it.
Thank you so much, Guido. I really spoken about the technical capacity gaps, data gaps, lack of a project pipeline, bankability of projects. Again, these are common challenges we found across countries. But one of the things we've also learned is that access to climate finance is not just about climate finance per se. We need often to understand the wider landscape of the country, of project development, of investment. And I'm going to invite Mutoni here because the African Development Bank has been one of our first ports of call in pretty much every country where SPARC has worked. And bank colleagues have advised us and pointed us in directions that we often do not consider in climate finance. The IMF Article 4 consultations is one example. Mutoni, I'm going to invite you to tell us about these wider challenges that countries need to overcome or start thinking about when we talk about access to climate finance.
Thank you, Manisha. Again, I'm London from Africa Development Bank. Just to speak about the wider perspective, just to pick up from where I believe just spoke about the issue of accessing climate finance from the International Climate Fund, such as GCM, GEM, Adaptation Plan, Climate Investment Plan. Just by a show of hands, how many have been involved in the process of either developing a climate proposal or the accreditation process? Okay. And what has been the, I know you said yours is 3 years. How long did it take you to get accredited? 4 years. Anybody else accreditation or even getting preparing the bankable proposals? I know there's a concept note, the whole comments from the concept note which come back and you get even more comments than the first time. How long did it take you to complete it? Anybody? So on average, it takes about 3 years onwards to either get the accreditation or even have your proposal move from the design stage, which is data intensive. For that countries receive, it's impossible to get the required data to form that rigorous climate rationale which the funds require. So even a bank working with GCM, we have worked on proposals where they have wanted data going back up to 30 years for fragile countries who are trying to access this climate finance. Where do you get this data with the infrastructure? Does it exist? when the records are not available. So this has been a big challenge in terms of getting for the international planning funds, which is adaptation fund. From the government fronts, there's always competing development priorities. Yes, climate change is a cause that urgently needs to be addressed. It's resource intensive, but you also have competing interests around social security. You have competing interests on energy, on water, on various factors, on health. And so you find a lot of governments are struggling to find the appropriate allocation of resources to put into climate action and resilience building. Also, we have wonderful NDCs which are being produced by government. Congratulations to Somalia on NDC 3. For this, we find one of the gaps that exists is that there's a gap. There's a gap between what is in the NDC in terms of priorities, costing. It really doesn't make it to the budget, the planning process, the national development plans for the country. So you find that in as much as you have your climate priorities, you've costed them, you've articulated them well, as long as they don't get into the national plans, they will not be budgeted for. And what that is not budgeted for does not get done. So this is one of the other challenges that we have faced. Lack of data I've spoken about. And also fragile countries, they really tend to be overlooked in comparison to other countries because of their low absorptive capacity. We find countries that absorb climate finance more, are able to design and implement their projects better, tend to get faster, tend to get more access to climate finance, and the fragile countries tend to up, which is something we have observed. The capacity to develop bankable proposals, I won't dwell on that much. I think other colleagues have spoken on that, in that gap. And a bit that's very tricky, but still very necessary, is in terms of sources of climate finance, is a private sector. For fragile countries, already the private sector is very averse in investing in the African market, be it due to real risks or perceived risks. It's just an area where they choose not to double. I think currently CPI, the Climate Policy Initiative, had done a study of climate finance flows from the private sector into the African market. It's a measly 14%. And out of that 14%, only 3% is going towards adaptation. So also making a strong case for public-private sector financing for adaptation has been a challenge. And so in as much as it's an area of great potential, it's really untapped. And finally, for the donors as well, it's the challenge that's coming up and increasingly emerging of it is the funding cuts that donors are receiving. And so they are having to either scale down or move away from climate change, prioritize or restructure, which is bringing a challenge towards the mobilization of climate finance. So that's just to highlight what the governments, private sector, the donor partners, and the international climate funds challenges being faced around that. Thank you.
Again, let's think about getting access to private sector finance. What does the private sector mean? Has come up in pretty much every country that we've worked. Guy, I'm looking for another 6 years of SPARC to be able to unpack this and have colleagues in the room to share our findings on this. We've heard a lot about the barriers that countries face, but one of the things we've also learned on the SPARC is that political systems and political changes in countries can be a barrier to countries accessing climate finance. Emmanuel, can I invite you here? I fondly call Emmanuel the SPARC climate finance lead for the Sahel. He has led our climate finance engagement in Niger, and we have faced extensive challenges there in terms of maintaining and increasing access to climate finance because of political changes. Emmanuel, how do we work in fragile conflict-affected settings which are politically difficult? What have you learned from our work in Niger?
So if I have to answer on your question. So in short, I will tell you it's quite difficult or not possible, but I will detail. For those who don't know who I am, I had the pleasure to do the keynote address yesterday. And in the same way, I will do my intervention by saying that indeed we had more than 3 years work in Niger to support them improving their access to climate finance and to help them also to be pioneer in terms of climate access, because this is related also to the Glasgow outcome, where when the UK take engagement to support some countries to get access to the finance, I mean the climate finance, and to link up also the climate finance with the humanitarian, the conflict resolution. I had a chance to facilitate many meetings in Niger with the government and different key stakeholders. The first thing that I have said is you are least developed countries. But I will tell you that being a least developed countries is not the end in itself. And I believe that when I will come back here in 2 years, you will shift being the emerging countries. Because sometimes you say that, yes, we will build LDCs, and we want to remain as a LDCs because of the support or the finance that we see. I don't know if you get the way I'm speaking. I'm always saying we need to shift in mindset. This said, yes, we start in 2023, then meeting with all key stakeholders, from the government, from the civil society organizations, from the international, organization, World Bank, IMF, etc. And then come the coup d'etat. I think it was in July, and everything collapsed. We have even met the cabinet of the head of states before. So it's become a permanent beginning, starting. And we said, with the support of FCDO, ODI, and the UK embassy, we should continue, because it is not just an issue for the government or the political leaders, but it is an issue for the community. We should not leave them like that, because they are really affected by the climate change and by the conflict. And we said we will start with civil society organization, because when we are talking about challenge, the governance issues is one, I mean in terms of approach. How to get all the stakeholders being involved in the process, particularly the civil society organization, the non-state actors, among this, the private sector. So we organized a meeting with them. It was a webinar because we couldn't reach there. And when the situation becomes stable, we organized a workshop. When we organized this workshop, we contribute in enhancing the information about what is climate finance, which is a bit complicated because until today, we do not have a common definition. We just agreed that climate finance is the resources, financial resources that are supporting adaptation, mitigation, and we add loss intervention. And that we enhance the information, we enhance the knowledge, because that is really crucial. And then they start with all the information that they receive, engaging within the process. That means we have this in the initiative. Nigeria have already submitted the National Adaptation Plan, which is a key priority, because the demand there per year in terms of climate finance is 1 billion per year. But from 2019 to 2023, they received $500 million US. And my question to them is, where all that money goes? This is what I asked them, and I will back on where the money goes. The civil society were engaged in the process. The private sector were engaged also in the process, because one of the key challenges is the small scale initiatives that need to be scaled by this finance that we receive. The other one, in terms of institution, we talked about already the instability, institutional instability, but the coordination at the country level is a key challenge. We have two heads that are leading these cross-cutting issues, because climate change is a cross-cutting issue. We have the National Committee on Environment and Development, who is the national designated authority. When we say national designated authority, it is the authorities who is leading the process within the Green Climate Fund. And for us, our belief, the national designated authority is not an institution. It is a team. We should help those who are looking the projects that are submitted on behalf of the countries. And we need a technical committee. We need a steering committee with all the ministries represented. But the NDA there is just a structure. How a structure could go through different projects that are submitted on behalf of the countries and deliver a letter of non-objection. They don't have the capacity. They don't have it. The second, we have the Ministry of Environment, who is leading the national determined contribution, and they are working on the NDC 3.0. And they don't have the possibilities or the facilities to work together. They are working separately for a common goal. How to really enhance the resilience of the countries. And the other ministries are not enough involved, even though the Ministry of Finance. That is for us a huge problem at the country level, and the problem remains. The other one, I think it was raised by you, is the technical capacities. Technical capacities to have experts to develop some project. If you look at the Green Climate Fund or the Green Climate Fund dashboard of Niger, you will see that Niger have 12 projects. There are 2 projects that are only national. There is the simplified approval process that they call the SAP for the inclusive green finance that are supporting the small order. And I think this one is really relevant, because this is what the civil society are requesting for, because it can allow them at least to develop some activities. But the rest is the multi-country project. That means that you can share it with Mali, you can share it with other countries, but even the national designated authority cannot know how much money is allocated to his country. How can you manage or monitor a project if you don't know how much money goes to the country? And the other things is because that these multi-countries projects are developed by the big institutions. And within this process, I will focus more on the Green Climate Fund. 60% of the resources that are gathered through these funds are done by 5 big institutions. They are not Africans. They are not even from developing countries. And these institutions took their administrative cost. And I told you that Nigeria have $5 million from 2019 to 2023. So there is a part of the money which go with some big institution, and only less than 10% go to communities. Based on that, how can we make some impact to help communities be really resilient? The other thing is, if there is no national committee on climate change, which is multi-stakeholder, where we have all the ministers, it will be really difficult to discuss about the climate change at the country level, where we have 2 heads that are leading one process. So I will not detail more, but I think based on what we have said, I do not want to repeat what he said, but I just add on different challenges that we have in these countries, because it is almost the same. But I reiterate again, our countries are certainly vulnerable, but we have a lot of opportunities. As I said, the small-scale initiatives that are really successful, if people can help in scaling up these initiatives, will have a really great impact in the field. So this is what I wanted really to share for the first part that you gave me the floor. And again, I would like to thank Abdullah for the innovation that you made, because these people were maybe on their phone if I was there, but now they are, I'm talking on their behalf. Thank you.
I suppose you know why these climate finance leads for West Sahel. Emmanuel, thank you for bringing out the important point that climate finance is not just about getting more money, it's about how we use it, how communities are benefiting, how is it helping small and medium industries in countries, because at the end of the day, these are the backbones of countries and society. Now, I have been advised that we are running behind time, and while I do have another round of questions for our speakers to help you understand more about what we've learned through our work, I'm going to take a pause here, and I hope my speakers are okay with that. We are going to invite contributions and questions from the floor. Please feel free, 3 to 4. Please feel free to direct a question to one of our speakers, or if you would like to make a contribution, please raise your hand. Peter, we have one here. We'll take 3, 4, and then time permitting, we will do a very quick round again with our panelists before we go to lunch.
Open question.
Thank you. All right. Thank you very much. From Ghana again, from the Central Region. And I just want to state this, that I've realized the researchers are not hearing any gender issues. I can see the researchers, they did the research are not gender sensitive, are not gender responsive. Because when we are looking at resilience and prosperity in dry lands, requires inclusive and gender responsive approach. Empowering women and men equally strengthens communities. Policies must integrate gender to ensure sustainable livelihood and food security and climate resilience. So I am expecting all, I will not say an
expecting for, but because I'm a gender expert, I am expecting to hear more on gender disaggregated data that will influence our policies, that will help us to know the different needs of both genders, that will also influence our budgets, just as you say, how to use the money. So that will also influence the budget. And if we are still looking at climate resilience approach, we should take into consideration risk assessment and early warning. Two, we will take into consideration adaptation and mitigation integration. We will take into consideration ecosystem-based approach. Four, inclusive community engagement. Five, resilience, infrastructure, and urban planning. Six, social protection and livelihood diversification. Seven, capacity building and education. Eight, gender and equity focus. Nine, policy and institutional strengthening. 10, monitoring, evaluation, and learning. I would like to end here. Thank you very much.
Okay, if we take a few more questions and then we can go forward. Yeah.
It's more an observation than a question, but maybe can become a question. Because when we talk about climate finance, we suddenly talk about GCA adaptation funds. When we talk about climate finance, we usually go to the mandated funds under the UNFCCC, rather than looking at the Paris Agreement or the commitment from developed countries to developing countries. In that sense, under the 100 million period that Julio mentioned, for example, BRICS gets 100% of the funding as bilateral climate finance, which will go towards projects or funds. So, and that's something that we don't sometimes realize. I'm sure that for all the projects that you are involved, they are counted as climate finance. And sometimes we don't even know that. But at the same time, by implementing those programs, what we have is an accountability in the way that we deliver those programs. And that's something that we recognize, for example, the way that we actually do our call for action. By saying, I receive climate finance, that they are to support people in addressing the climate vulnerability. And this is the way that we are doing it, in a way that is actually addressing the issue that my colleague is actually bringing to the table as well. So we need to recognize that, otherwise we just miss the point. GCF is small. We need to look at resilient finance, that is looking at all sources of finance. And we need that we need to address what not only the short-term risk, but the long-term risk. And everyone has a role that have the multilateral development funds that they will look at maybe 10 to 15 years. We have bilateral climate funds that we look at immediate needs. And that is space that we look at for the big picture, rather than just focusing on 1 or 2 months, that they are designed to fail. We can get them better, but that's not the end game for this type of discussion.
Thank you. My name is Bridget. Very interesting discussions that have happened here. Just as our colleague has just highlighted, a shift of mindset is very important for all of us. But I would like us to pause and ask ourselves a question. How much have our minds shifted in this room where we are, where it is a research and policy dialogue, but we are largely underrepresented in terms of the groups that are here? Are we thinking about accountability to the affected people and community engagement? That's one of us has highlighted. Yesterday in financing, Mary what was told yesterday and putting it in financing, thinking about the voices of the locals, localization of climate change, anticipatory action. What is our shift in terms of the mindset? How are we engaging key stakeholders? When we put policies across without relevant people in the room, what is that going to happen? Are we going to have policies go on the shelf and we tick the box? We wouldn't certainly want to do that. But exciting, I would say sort of discussion that Emmanuel has highlighted on engaging everybody all the way from government, CSOs, NGOs, donors, but the people themselves, where are they? They have a voice in what we want to make policies for, because when we're going to get policies out of this room, we are going to get funds and really start to hear how long it takes to get money or other approvals for climate change. But then when it goes back, are they implementable in the sense of it that did we bring the right people in the room? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. My question is, in regard to climate finance, how can we make the case for the disaster risk financing, especially the agri finance such as anticipatory action, to make the case for the climate? Because, of course, climate finance is mitigation and adaptation, but we know even disaster risk management is more about adapting to the influence of the climate change. So, what case can the DRF disaster risk finance make to also access climate finance? Because, like as Mauricio was saying, like we need to also think beyond the short-term aspect of it, the longer term of building resilience.
Thanks, Jaida. Those four sets of questions, I realize now we should have introduced with the discussion, but we're short of time because the next set of questions that we want to get into, we have talked exactly about that. How are we using climate? Do we have gender disaggregated data? Are we building that inclusiveness in finance? How are we supporting livelihood inclusions in the conversation? Climate risk assessments. I'm talking about resilience finance, and now we spoke about the question of the issue of disaster risk finance. I am hoping very quickly, Nasra and Isaiah, if I can invite you to make a contribution here, because we were going to have these two colleagues tell us what they are hearing on the ground about the priorities of climate finance. How do communities want climate finance used, and what are they saying? And then I'm going to invite Tony here. Tony, I told you on the spot, but you are the only financier we have as a speaker, and we know that the bank is doing a lot now along the lines of talked about resilience finance, etc., to support member states, support organization finance. So I'd love for you to come after that. To make an intervention. Isaiah, can we start with you? Because Vivek is standing next to you and I'll give the microphone to Nasra to come in.
Great, and I certainly think Nasra can do an excellent job of speaking specifically as to what their discussions with communities have revealed, but I think my take on this question is a different one, which is in the context of fragility that we've been discussing. What is fragile in what we've been talking about? State institution, state capacity, state coordination. We haven't even got to the level of speaking our communities themselves fragile in this context. And in Somalia in particular, I think you have incredibly robust, informal, traditional institutions at the community level. So this narrative that there's just prevailing fragility in a context like Somalia falls apart very quickly when you leave the airport in Mogadishu and when you engage directly with communities. And so then to the other part of Manisha's question, these robust communities that are capable of managing natural resource-based conflict, and in many cases have just stopped managing that conflict when NGOs came in and said, we would do it, and then abdicated that role, right? So that's why a lot of natural resource conflict goes unmanaged. But when you ask communities, what they're asking for is, food security is first and foremost what they're looking to find. And so climate finance can be food security, right? In any intervention you're doing, you can find a way of boosting rapid agroecological food and fodder production as part of a restoration or mitigation or adaptation program, right? So we need to think that it's not just mitigation dividends or adaptation dividends. We can also deliver humanitarian dividends. So by putting all of these pieces together, by setting aside for a moment this hierarchy of humanitarian transitions to development, climate finance comes in when it's convenient, all of those things can and should happen at once if we're willing to lean into stacking co-benefits, integrating humanitarian programming into adaptive processes. Because then if we have humanitarian money, we can speak that language. But if we have adaptation money, we can speak that language, right? I think our role is translators of what are the language that these powerful institutions want to hear, but then at the end of the day, delivering the common result for communities. So maybe Nasra will speak a little bit more on the community.
Thank you, Isaiah and Manish, for that. What communities are saying, I said that the solution of being working with community voices are, and the data from Somalia is showing that communities are tired of these short-term cycle humanitarian interventions, and they want to see a significant shift balance from emergency funding to adaptations. Another account said by a member who is in the coverage in Somalia district, he said, we know the boreholes and showers have dried up. We keep seeing humanitarian intervention where it is water tracking and so on. But what we want is how are we going to cope if this project ends? We can't transport through land because you can't access that district through land. And it's only going to be through airports. We have connections with the private sectors, diaspora communities, but what we want is the solutions that are coming out from the ground to be settled by our voices. That's what the community is saying. Communitarian responses is not enough to adapt to. And in the end, what the communities are asking for, they are not asking to be saved. They're asking for tools that can be used to save themselves. And trying climate adaptation measures, it should be such a fragile context, is the only viable path to break cycles of crisis. Thank you.
Can I invite you?
Yep, thank you. So I think from the discussions, what has been clear is the scarcity of development finance. And I think from the Africa development perspective, Africa Development Bank perspective, and also from other multilateral development banks, what we have been trying to do is to ramp up the access of climate finance. Somebody had said here, when we talk about climate finance, we're only thinking about electricity and purchase, but there's such a wider area where climate finance can be mobilized from, including domestic resource mobilization, which is often overlooked, and also the role of the FDBs who have also been raising their commitments towards climate action. So we've come together as 10 multilateral development banks, and we have this joint framework on climate finance tracking. So together we look at who's financing what, how much you're putting into that, what are you counting as climate finance, and we have methodologies to do that to be able to help us see what's going where and where can we ramp up efforts. Then also, just from the discussion on how difficult it is to mobilize climate finance from international climate funds, the Africa Development Bank has been seeing firsthand. We're also accredited to some of these funds, and we do the co-financing as well. And we see how difficult it is for regional member countries to access these resources. So what we introduced in 2023 is a climate action window. And this is a fund that's really targeted and designed to solve these issues. From project proposal development to proposal acceptance and disbursement, takes a short time of about a year. And then also we really try to customize the needs of the countries to these funding requirements. I think in the presentation that was made earlier, it was said that the global finance architecture is not really targeted or customized to certain countries. So, for example, where you have a huge amount of data, the climate action window does make exceptions in terms of the amount of data you need to put in. We have alternative sources of data which can be accepted when you're developing your climate rationale. And from this, we're targeting to raise $13 billion under the climate action window. 75% of those resources will go specifically for adaptation because that's Africa's greatest. And then 15% will go to mitigation, 10% to technical assistance. So far, we've mobilized $429, generous contribution of the UK government as well, Germany, and Switzerland, and the Netherlands. And we have disbursed already the money for adaptation. And we hope that we will be able to have an additional window for countries to get additional climate finance. We also have the transition support facility, which is targeted specifically for the prevention side. We have a prevention envelope and a response envelope, which is just really supposed to address the specific challenges of the fragile country space. And we also do capacity building at the TSF, which again, the countries are able to be equipped to the knowledge to mobilize private finance, identify other areas where you can come from. And we also have the African Financial Alliance Coalition for Climate Change. And this just goes down to the domestic resource mobilization, local financial institutions, pension funds, insurance companies. These are people who are sitting on a huge reservoir of resources, but never look at it as an avenue which they can mobilize or create opportunities on climate change. So through AFA, we work with them to be able to mainstream climate change to their operations and see ways in which they can partner with development finance institutions, international climate funds, to mobilize and scale our Thank you.
We do have a few more minutes to continue the discussion, and I hope 15. Oh, excellent. So I'm going to ask if Emmanuel, Abdullahi, and Buyo have further thoughts on what we've heard in the room today about the call for climate action, about resilience finance, about gender disaggregated data, making finance work for all communities, for all people. Can I start with you?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I will start at one point when we talk about the gender. And I like that word. I still remember when I was very here and I was working with WFP. We had like a program called school feeding. And the school feeding program we have introduced in take-home ration. And the take-home ration we have been targeting girls. We had one objective saying like increasing enrollment and increasing attendance so that girls can enroll and attend. And this take-home ration, which is specific to the girls, can attract them. It was really excellent. But what did happen? What has happened? It has happened to create gender equity issue, not gender equality. So when we talk about the gender, because boys have been overtaken, boys go to school because they take conversion and all these kind of things. So we have to do again this kind of analysis. So when we talk gender, we must be very realistic of what are we saying. For example, the MPCs of Somalia is talking about, if you go to the adaptation, I can see we have a whole big budget line item called gender equity and social inclusion. So we have to look at that perspective. And it's allocated like 30% that budget to be led by women, for example. We shouldn't forget about the other parts of the gender. That is the gender. Now, when it comes into the entire, the overall climate finance, there is one very important aspect that we need to really thinking about. And often that is a big issue. And what it is, it's a coordination. And coordination between the governments, coordination between the partners, coordination between the donors and the multilateral fund, the bilateral fund. This reminds me, I think it was an English prophet saying when it says like, when the root is deep, there's no reason to fear the wind. So if climate finance is organized at country level, and the countries are really low on what are their priorities, how are these different strategies and the plans are integrated? For example, Somalia, let me say, it has an NDC, which has an X figure of budget. It has a NAP, which has an X, Y figure of budget. And it has NTE, National Transformation Plan, which has Z figure of budget. But how are all these budgeted? Are interlinked and are interrelated. For example, the entire adaptation plan budget, which has been specifically identified in the adaptation plan, national adaptation plan, had already been taken care of in the NDC. And the entire NDC budget had already been taken within the national transformation plan. So when it happens into like that, and the whole government system works, then the whole of society also should work. And that attracts the funding when the government is coordinated and when the bilaterals, multilaterals, and the implementing partners are coordinated. However, the issue which affects private financing, the biggest element in the room is coordination. And that coordination is not only, we often see donors and the partners blame the governments, but it's not in that sense at all. You can see the implementing partners are not speaking to one another, and we have excellent case examples in Somalia when the coordination actually almost kills the climate finance. So I think we need really to look at and to really focus at all levels is that climate finance coordination. Thank you.
Thank you. Guyo, can I invite you to share your thoughts?
Yes, thank you very much. I think the conversation, it's very interesting. The panel discussion, I'll go on that definitely. It's very rich. It builds on and very systematically and away from quite a number of presentations that I could do. So for me, a few things. We need to think about a few things. As far as we're in the global network that is plugged to the public financing, I think we need to change a few levels. The first level, I think we should push the ambition at the global level. Really, we're living in very difficult time. I think if you're bargaining for higher, you could. I think at least the voice will get there. Of course, there are many things to work on. Commitment, the legality to commit, and how to track commitment. There are many noise in there for those who are going to call. Every time you get disgruntled, every time you come back to call. As we said, one day again. It's a conversation, it's a very global conversation. One have to be there. But I think on the preparedness at the regional level, we're looking at two possibilities where you have a blend of regional voice and the country-specific agenda. Countries are very different, especially within IGAD. You have countries which have institutionally made quite long history of conflict and all these things. So there must be a push to say, can we have tailored support? I think what was only mentioned is one important aspect that can be skewed to support some of these countries within a particular window that favors this reality. But then regionalization of the agenda around climate, taking our region, drought is a big issue. And we really need to rally around that and push member states to amplify this voice, whether you apply from the country, especially for transboundary spaces where we manage drought using mobility and solutions. This is a very important agenda. So for me, I think if we do that at 2-3 level, regional national blend, get the right, have a better voice in there. But I think part of me also say that when international agenda and plan collapses, so what do you do? What Trump did was, it's an interesting lesson for these global voices around something. How do you defend existing private sector opportunities in the country? What does domestic financing look like? Is there a possibility for that growing to a certain level to bring some of this stuff? What do communities feel about all these issues? I think for me, these are very important areas to deepen the conversation and action that we wish.
Thank you. Emmanuel, can I bring you in? I'm going to request you to put on your GNDRR hat. And well, he's an expert of all seasons and for all topics. The question, the issue that Tyler spoke about, and Murray raised, building resilience to disasters, it starts at the beginning. Climate finance is much broader than just accessing these international funds. So please share your thoughts about how we can build, how we get finance, build resilience, all types of disasters.
Yeah, my focus is sustainable land management, and sustainable land management brought me to almost these many issues. I mean, land degradation. It is linked with climate change. It is linked with disaster. And finance also is really important for sustainable land management. So if you see me in all this arena, my focus is land degradation. And for me, having the synergy of all these frameworks is really important. So the synergy is one. The second thing is just to give some answer related to gender, particularly on the Recurrent Climate Fund. There is the Gender Action Plan that is there, and I think that in many mechanisms, there is the Gender Action Plan. So the finance is not only with the vertical climate finance. If I take the example of Nigeria received just 2%. So that means that there are other sources of funds that provide resources to deal with adaptation and mitigation. So this is important to say. When you're talking about disaster, someone has raised the issue of rationale. There are many types of disaster, but here, if I'm not wrong, you're talking about climate change. So if it is climate change, you have to look at the slow onset events and the rapid onset events. It is important to know exactly about what we are talking. And in the rationale, if you're developing, for example, a project which is not linked to climate change, I mean, just an example. You want to restore your land, and you say, I will restore my land for increasing the agricultural production. And you send it to the adaptation fund or the green climate fund. They will not support you. But when you say, I will restore land because of salinization, the salinization is a climate change issue. That is clear. And we can say it's maybe a disaster. It's development or coastal erosion can be a disaster when it affects a lot of communities. But all these things are linked when we talk about climate change. That brought me also into gender, and now I'm chairing the network. I would like just to add on this. There is a need, definitely, in the countries that we have a tracking system or monitoring system about the finance to know what is related to climate change and to decentralize the policy. First, to align the policies, it was said, with the ambition of the countries. Second, to decentralize the policy. I mean, help the localities to have their territorial climate plan. And then after it will be easier to decentralize the climate finance. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to leave the last word with you, because we work together on this agenda. You heard all of our speakers, you heard some of the contributions, the thoughts that colleagues have in the room. Is there anything that we haven't spoken about that you would want to tell us before we head for lunch, but also in terms of what next in this area of work, what next in terms of opportunities that we need to tap into to bring in some of this thinking, get resilience finance for fragile conflict effects?
Sure. I think a lot of things have been mentioned. And those are a lot of things that we've also been working. Perhaps, I can interpret like everything that has been said as just sort of like two currents of Africa. In the sense that you're going to talk about what we can do with what we already have, the existing resources, while trying to improve the system, the mechanisms for what we don't have. I'm not gonna try to mention everything that has been said, but in terms of like what do we do better with the existing resources? I think Isaiah made a good point. Is a lot of things are already happening, especially in communities on the ground. And so it is about rethinking how we use better the funds that we have. You have made the example of humanitarian financing and so on. My colleague Mario made the case of actually when you think about finance, you should be thinking more broader than just spiritual fund. You should be thinking about all the resources that we have, use them in the right way to build resilience. And so a lot of this already happened. We don't need to wait for the perfect condition, but we need to document what's happening. Right? So that while we were to build a system to be able to access money that we don't have yet, we can show that the concept of things can be done. And so when the system is sort of like more adapted, this kind of context, we can automatically scale up what we already have. In terms of also what we already have, several people mentioned international private finance, the private sector. They've also mentioned, for instance, diaspora finance. I think we should be looking more at this kind of connection mechanism. Diaspora finance, strong connection to local realities and local communities, or how we can support them to also contribute to business outcomes. And in terms of like what we don't have yet, people talked about the carbon finance capital letters. So many of you think about carbon funds, different funds, green environmental facility. And I said before that the current things are not signed for present countries. And so what needs to be done, what has been mentioned, fundamentally for me is to build trust among financiers, the international community, that they can invest in this kind of environment. And a lot of ways to build this trust that have been mentioned. For instance, ILRI mentioned that we need to have like credible strategies and plans to convince people that they can invest here. We need to have inclusive governance that have the right policies in the group so that risk by you are accepting and to do. But I think it's also really about shifting mindset, advocating and self-advocating to make sure that finance reaches those that are the most needy. And one thing that I often say is that from talking to people in countries, communities, and so on, they always tell us that we don't care about funds. Just to care about them getting the That's all. Thank you.
Great. Please, everyone, give a huge round of applause to our speakers and enjoy lunch. So we would encourage you to ask questions, continue one-to-one conversations with them. The SPARC team, which has worked on the climate finance research, is also here. We'd be very happy to tell you more about our work in countries and share these resources with you to see how it can help you with your work. So let's not drop the conversation here. Let's keep it going for lunch and, of course, beyond today as well. Peter, thank you very much.